This panel is about the Siege of Sarajevo. We're actually going to talk a bit about the siege itself and covering the siege, and then lessons that apply to today, and of course there's many. Thank you for those opening remarks. I won't give as much context as I wanted to. I know some of you have never been in Sarajevo before. And as we just heard, this hotel was a place where a lot of journalists were stationed. This hotel was built for the Winter Olympics. It was not built for a war. And you'll see a lot of other facilities around Sarajevo that were built for the Olympics. The huge, enormous television building up the road towards the airport was built for the Olympics and became a very important place during the siege. This hotel has relevance to me. I was here during the Olympics as a college student and then here as a journalist. Our panel's going to go back 30 years to talk about the siege, as I said, and some of the things we learned that made us better. Before we do that, I want to say one thing, daring to inject a bit of lightness here. If you were journalists arriving 30 years ago, you wouldn't have arrived in the way you did. You would have come in on a UN flight, which was free, and the name of the airlines unofficially was Maybe Airlines, because they didn't always get here. You would be able to enjoy your descent into Sarajevo, which was a corkscrew, very steep descent, because there were rival armies surrounding the airport. You would get out of the airport. If you were lucky, you would get a ride in a UN armored vehicle. If you were like most journalists, you'd come in a regular car. Your driver would instruct you to open your window, because if you were shot, you were more likely to be hit by shards of glass than the bullet itself. You would drive very quickly into the city on what was known as Sniper's Alley, and if you were staying at the Holiday Inn, you would tear into the garage, gather your belongings, and enter through the rear. You would never come in through the front entrance. Why? Because the front line, the Bosnian Serb positions were 300, 400 meters. If you walk to the river across the main road, you will see high-rise buildings, and that's where the Bosnian Serb positions were. So in the end, though, in spite of those conditions, we were lucky. We were privileged in this hotel. We were taken care of. We had access to food and water, alcohol, that ordinary Bosnians really could only dream of. And we did what we did. We did it on the backs of Bosnian journalists, Bosnian translators, who in some ways were the real journalists here in what they did and the risks they took. On that note, I want to introduce our panel. I don't know if you want to come up and sit down and I can introduce you, or I'll introduce you. First, sitting here is Aida Čerkez. Aida. Yes. Aida began working for the Associated Press at the beginning of the Bosnian War. She became an international reporter. In 2017, she joined the OCCRP, Organized Crime and Corruption Project, as a news editor. She has a master's degree in peace research and communications and has been involved in the work of the Center for Investigative Journalism in Bosnia since it was founded 20 years ago. To Aida's left, Duška Jurišić. Duška was a reporter for Duška Jurišić, izvini. Duška was a reporter for radio television in Bosnia-Herzegovina during the war from 92 to 95. After completing extensive academic work in the United States, she was editor-in-chief of the news program of federal television and later editor-in-chief of all programs of federal television. She was also general manager of television of Canton Sarajevo. Last year, Duška was appointed Deputy Minister for Human Rights and Refugees of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Next to Duška, Damir Šagolj. At the outbreak of the war, Damir was not a journalist. He became a soldier, served in the army of Bosnia and Herzegovina to help defend the city from Serbian national forces who wanted to, if not occupy the city, divide it and create what they dreamed of would be an ethnically pure Sarajevo. In 1996, Damir joined Reuters news agency. A flurry of assignments followed to Albania, Iran, conflicts in Kosovo, Iraq, Lebanon, Afghanistan, Israel, Palestine, including Gaza. Damir lived for nearly a decade in Asia, where he was a Reuters chief photographer in China. In 2018, Damir shared a Pulitzer Prize as part of the Reuters team that covered the Rohingya crisis. Damir returned to Bosnia in 2018 and currently teaches at the University of Sarajevo, and he's also the co-founder and director of the WARM Foundation. John, on the end there, John Daniszewski. John is a vice president for standards, editor-at-large for the Associated Press. Prior to that, John spent more than a decade as AP's international editor and 20 years as a foreign correspondent for the AP and Los Angeles Times. That included covering the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, the end of apartheid in South Africa, the Middle East, wars in Iraq, Rwanda, Afghanistan. John is also a member of many prestigious boards, including the Pulitzer Board, and he is IPI's North America National Committee Chair and Special Representative for Journalist Safety. Okay, so as I said, we're going to start talking a little bit about the siege. I really want to get into that a little bit because it is important for what this city represents, for what this hotel represents. And Aida, I want to start with you. You were a young mother in 1992. Yugoslavia was breaking apart. We've had the war in Croatia. We had all sorts of indications that this place was going to blow up. The Bosnian Serbs had carved out their state, their fascist state, I would say. The ethnic cleansing hadn't quite begun, but there were a lot of signs that something really bad was going to happen. And ironically, the United Nations, in their great wisdom, had chosen Sarajevo as a safe place to conduct peacekeeping operations in Croatia, not realizing, apparently, that this was about to blow up. So the first question for you is, how did you go from whatever you were doing in that moment to decide to become a reporter, or to decide to at least start working for a news organization?
I didn't decide. The war decided. I studied something completely different. I studied German language and literature. I never worked with German. But the war started. I had a little son. He's sitting here in the first row. It's the biggest guy in the whole, in all of these seats. He was a toddler. He was a baby at the time. And I was one of those Sarajevans who denied the trouble that was coming. And I think that is what almost everybody does before a war. I've seen that in Ukraine, where people just didn't, I spoke to people in Ukraine 2 days before the Russians rolled in, and they were trying to convince me that nothing is going to happen. It's just a military exercise. And I was I did not want to argue with them. I wasn't angry with them, because I recognized myself in them. And it's the denial, even when it started shooting, we were still denying that this is happening. And that, I guess that's a kind of a defense mechanism. Anyway, I decided, we all went to the basement, and I decided I have to do something about this. I can't just wait for this to go. And there was, in the neighborhood, there was something like a territorial defense, and I reported over there and wanted to become a soldier. Everybody was rolling on the floor, laughing, fine, But, they asked me, what can you do? And wash clothes, and, I speak languages. So there's this guy over here. He's a liaison officer. And he came to tell us something. We don't understand what he wants. So, okay, I can help. And the guy turns out to be French. I don't speak a word of French. And but somehow I became the person who would help out when foreigners would come. And then the next day, the next foreigners who came were journalists. And as I was translating, I realized that their job is probably here more important than what any of these guys do. And I joined them.
you know, one thing to point out, a lot of people didn't want to think there was going to be a war here. This is April 1992. I remember, though, April 5th, people did not just believe, they went out and had huge demonstrations for peace against war. So they were willing to, you know, tens of thousands of people right out here in front of the hotel, in front of Parliament. And on April 6th, they were fired on by gunmen from this hotel, because this hotel was the headquarters of the Serbian Democratic Party, the party of the Serbian nationals, Radovan Karadzić's party. And that day of the 6th, those demonstrators stormed this hotel, and the gunmen were apprehended. Karadzić fled to the mountains, and this hotel was closed for a couple of months, and it finally reopened. Duška, were you also one of those people who didn't think the war would happen in the early years? You were already working at radio television.
Sometimes, even now, people, actually almost every day, people ask me, is there going to be the war in Bosnia again because of all these political tensions? And although I'm now a politician, I'm saying, no, it's not going to be the war, but I'm completely wrong address, because I thought that war wouldn't happen in 1990s, and I stayed here. Difference between me and Aida is that I'm a lawyer, but I always wanted to be the journalist. So I didn't know that I would like to be so, but I didn't imagine that I would be war correspondent. And one joke on the very beginning of the war, when Aida became the journalist, she cut her hair very, very short. And she was, since she's a little bit older than I am, we used to meet, and she was very, very hippie, and I loved it. And I wouldn't say that she was my idol, but she was something like that. And her long hair was really, really beautiful. When I saw her, almost bald, I said, well, this is it, the war started. So this is a little bit female point of view. When I realized that, so it wasn't, my husband, that was my partner by that time, we were dreaming in that April about our honeymoon. And the only money which we gathered and saved was meant to be for the Paris, but we spent it for the food and wood because of the lack of electricity. So after the first shots, in the night of 5th April to 6th April, of course, I wanted to come to my work, and it was 10 kilometers from my house. But besides the shelling and sniper fire, I was stunned with the fact that radio television building was almost completely empty. So before the war, 2,400 people used to come and work on radio television of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And of course, my first thought was, okay, people are scared. And probably their bosses told them not to come. But it took us maybe 24 hours of time to find out that many of them actually went to the Serb side.
Left.
They left. And immediately when I noticed that they have already established Serb television and a Serb news agency, that was one of the proofs that there was a hell of a plan of the Siege of Sarajevo and military operation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and that is very serious. There was also another story. So these people who went to Pale and who literally betrayed us, left us alone, and didn't tell us anything, what is going to happen. So they said some of the journalists did have the connection with them, and they were telling, be silent, be quiet, everything will be okay, because we will come back in 3 days. And Aida and I were analyzing these thoughts and actually finding out that the plan was to have a blitzkrieg. They thought
Right.
Sarajevo would be occupied in 3 days, and something like that didn't happen. So about journalism and about television in Bosnia and Herzegovina and the role, we can speak later. But however, for domestic people, for the Bosnians and Herzegovinians who are completely lost, I can say that information, the news was like the food. So it was so strange, completely, what was going on. It was so frightening. They didn't watch CNN. They didn't have the access to Associated Press and Reuters, but they did have the access to their radio, television, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and they did have the access to the newspapers Oslobođenje because editors and journalists were on the streets selling the newspaper.
Yes.
And maybe it is too early to say, but I just do not want to forget this. The issue of credibility and integrity of the media based in Sarajevo, and that is radio, television, Bosnia and Herzegovina, newspapers, Oslobođenje, and 2 weekly magazines, Slobodna Bosna and Dani, was in the fact that, yes, we were talking about violations, or we were reporting about violations of human rights. We were reporting about war crimes, but as well, after the war, immediately when we recognized that, we were also reporting about war crimes which were done against the Serbs and Croats. And that is enormous difference between the media based in Sarajevo and other local media in Bosnia and Herzegovina, on Croat or the Serb side.
Just as a point of note, so for you, those of you not from here, Pale became the Bosnian Serb nationals headquarters up in the mountains. And one of those strange qualities of the war, it was near Mount Jaharina, which was another Olympic venue, which they occupied. So those of us who could go across the lines up to the mountain, you would get the opportunity to interview a future convicted war criminal in an Olympic venue. It was very, very strange. Damir, you were on the front lines. You were not a journalist yet, and you had a certain view or opinion of the journalists coming in with cameras and wanting to get their pictures. What was your feeling about all that as a person defending Sarajevo?
I believe I share what's the rest of Sarajevo population who didn't have any business to do with the foreigners would have to say, and it was awkward, I must say, and I was not very happy to see somebody taking a picture of my mother carrying canisters of water, and that had a great impact, I would say, on my career, looking down the road, and I didn't have any contacts basically with any of the journalists apart from the fact that my father, Mirko Šagolj, was the journalist of Oslobođenje and one of those guys who were running the newspaper from the basement of Oslobođenje, if you remember.
Yes.
They had those shifts, right? That's when Oslobođenje was officially the best newspaper in the world, right? 1993 or 1992.
And literally the editor-in-chief, you would see him out on Kemal Kuzbajic, you'd see him out on the streets in the morning with the morning edition, selling them. And your father perhaps as well.
No, he was sending me to sell it. me and my brother. So I had my journalism was through Oslobođenje and through my father. And looking, now we are actually thinking about to do something about that Oslobođenje thing. I don't think that happens very often, that you are in a war zone and you have such a good local newspaper, and I think that that fact had influenced the quality of the journalism that came out of Sarajevo in general, including the foreigners, because they had a very, very good local paper, and it is really a miracle. And then I start meeting the foreign journalists. Actually, as a soldier, I worked by the end of the war at the propaganda unit of the Bosnian headquarters, and my job was to pick up some of the journalists and give them access to the front lines. I actually came to your office once in a uniform, and that was
I had no choice but
By
to let
the-
you in.
that was by the end of the war, and this is when I actually realized that the end of the war is coming, and that I need to do something with the fact that my old profession, something that I studied for, had vanished, just as lives vanish.
You had studied engineering in Moscow, is that right?
I-
Because your
I-
dad was a correspondent.
I studied, and I have a master's in power engineering, but that had vanished just as the half of the, or the whole country had vanished, the whole industry. So I actually, the journalism was my plan B that I have picked up right after the war in Bosnia, and then I used this vacuum, this empty space, because all big names of journalism moved somewhere else, to Chechnya or to Rwanda. But the Bosnia story was still hot. You know, there's always momentum. The story always carries, with all the mass graves and war crimes, and this is where I jumped in,
So this is in 1996.
That's in
The siege had been lifted.
Yeah.
UN was here, or NATO was here,
Yeah.
and that's when you started. And I want to ask you a follow-up, but I want to get to John first and then circle back. So John, you had been to a lot of places in the world, but not Sarajevo, and certainly not Sarajevo under siege. What was it like? I think you came here a few months into the war, maybe summer of '92.
Yeah, I arrived in late May, so about a month or 6 weeks
just a month
after
ago.
the war began. And I was going to tell the story about the corkscrewing down. That was
It's fun.
Yeah, it was. You were in these C-3 cargo planes, sort of strapped into the side, and you didn't really have windows. You just had this eerie feeling of twirling around right before you evened out and landed. And then it was, you ran a gauntlet to get into the city. At first, we had just soft cars. At that time, we just called them cars. And I remember the day after I came in, there was a CNN camera woman who was shot through the jaw by a sniper. And that was my experience at Sarajevo. It was already at war. Death was pretty ubiquitous and random. So one of the early stories I wrote was actually about Igor, who's sitting here now, and the fact that Aida told me that when she left him for the day, she always left a note in his backpack about him and asking people to take care of him in case she was killed during the course of the day, and that story really affected me. Sarajevo was a heroic place at that time. It had been expected to be overwhelmed quickly, but and the people here had very little in the way of food or running water or electricity, and somehow they made do by cutting down all the trees in the city to burn firewood. Funerals were held in parks or at a football stadium. People were buried when they were killed. And right out in front of the presidency, I remember, seeing bodies lying on the ground after a mortar strike. It really made you appreciate the importance of being here and trying to tell those stories to the wider world. One of the crazy things were there were Canadian peacekeepers in town, but they weren't really keeping the peace. They were mostly protecting themselves, and they would, they would issue statements. And there was a very good UNHCR officer here to deal with displaced people, but. to go out to where they were in the post office, sort of near the airport, and to get there was really brutal. And over time, the journalists, I would come in on 2 or 3 week tours, and the AP had the style of parachuting people in for short periods, and then coming out. But when you did that, you would see the real heroism of the people living here, and I think Oslobođenje and radio television, Bosnia-Herzegovina were examples of that.
Just one more question about the siege itself. You know, we talk a lot about what we didn't have, no cell phones, really no phones at all, except expensive satellite phones, no social media, none of the tools a lot of us use today for our investigations, no satellite images that were at least offered to us by the CIA. So not a lot of the things we use as basic tools for investigating war crimes. We weren't even talking about the term war crimes at the beginning of the war. But one thing we did have is, it was the pre-digital era, so news organizations had a lot of money back then. My newspaper had a daily circulation of 1.1 million, and that was one of 5 newspapers in London. To any of it, but John, I mean, and that for a lot of reasons, but because the money was there, this issue of safety became very relevant. News organizations got armored vehicles. We got, flak jackets and helmets, and a much more serious, robust conversation about journalist protection started there. And John, you're deeply involved in that today. Is it fair to say there is I mean, it's not the only place, obviously this was discussed, but it does seem like there's a trajectory that goes from Sarajevo to one trajectory that gets us to the trainings that are done now, the conversations that happen at all news organizations, the risk assessments that most of us have to do to put together before any of us go anywhere. Hopefully that applies to people we're working with in the field. But John, is that a fair sort of, was that an important
Yes,
moment?
I and a number of other journalists had been shot during the Romanian Revolution, but it was really in Sarajevo when body armor, armored cars, helmets came into being, and it was really during the Balkan conflicts that people began to question whether it was worth marking your vehicles with TV signs, because you began to feel that made you more of a target than an ordinary vehicle. And it's gone, if you remember, the 1990s and early 2000s were just almost continuous conflict, small wars around the world, but Bosnia was the place where news organizations really began to armor up, the networks would hire security consultants. Often former British commandos took those jobs. And not only that, but trauma training became very important, the psychological care of journalists after those years of fighting. It started with Slovenia and then Croatia, then Bosnia happened, which was the worst of them all, and then finally it ended up with Kosovo, and those wars really, over the course of those wars, the conversations about safety of journalists really changed.
Yeah, and I want to move ahead because we want to leave some time for questions. It's interesting you mentioned Kosovo. So Kosovo was 1999, do the math, 4 years, 3.5 years after the end of the Bosnian War. But by that time, I remember this distinctly, we as reporters were all looking for evidence of war crimes. That whole notion had entered our working lexicon. We had learned from, Rwanda, Chechnya, a lot of horrible things that happened, but it was very different than in the middle of the Bosnian War, with some notable exceptions of the reporters who went up north and found the Serbian concentration camps. Okay, I want to skip ahead. Damir, I want to go back to you. You've described Bosnia as having an incredible impact for the young reporters who were here. A lot of the people here were young. I want to ask you a double-ended question here. how did the experiences you had here, defending your city under siege, how did it inform the work, your relationship to your subjects in other war zones? People who you were photographing, how did that inform and shape your relationship to your subjects in all the other conflicts you covered?
Yeah, that is a good question, and I'm sure it will apply to many people in this room. The so-called locals, not locals. The fact that it's your story that you're being reported on, and then later on you switch, you go behind the camera, and you become one who reports. You're the one then who pulls the trigger, and obviously that leaves a lot of scars and things that that are not really good. But there's this thing that you had lived, you have been that victim that you are now going to photograph or report. So obviously there's a number of things that you have, or I have in this case, because I came from Sarajevo, from that side, such as probably the most important is the distance. To what distance you go to your subject. What would be the point that you enter or exit its comfort zone. And that's one thing is if you interview somebody about those feelings, and completely other thing is if you had your own feelings. So I really believe that being a part of a big story as a citizen, just one of citizens of Sarajevo, helped me better position myself toward the, if you want, pain of others in the other wars I covered.
I think we probably want to leave about 15 minutes for questions. Yeah. Okay. So briefly, my last question to each one of you, I would like to talk a lot longer. Can you give one relevant example, you've already talked about it a little bit, about how your experiences here in Sarajevo made you a better journalist? Aida?
It made me a journalist. But I can tell you why I became a journalist. Watching what was going on around me, I was just thinking that this has to have some other purpose. This tragedy, if it doesn't push the world a little bit forward in any sense, then it doesn't make any, then it's useless, And I was thinking about the role of journalists who would be coming in, and I found that it is actually the most important role that anybody had, in my view, in a war. Because you have to imagine, if you're in a siege, you're actually a prisoner who cannot go anywhere without electricity, without water, without heating, without anything, without food. But you don't know what you did to deserve that, one thing, and you don't know how long your sentence will be. And and that's actually what interests you the most. That information is more important to you than food. That's why it was so important what local journalists did, because they gave some sense to people of what is happening and why, and how long this is going to last. On the other hand, I was working with foreign journalists, and I felt a certain hatred toward the outside world, because when this started, probably like everybody in Gaza, like everybody in Ukraine, I thought that if people would know what's going on here, they would do something about this. And I thought if I report what's going on, something is going to happen. It was 2 years later that I realized that I almost wanted to quit, because I realized that I am actually yelling into deaf people's ears. Nothing is happening until somebody told me, a very old man, told me that, yeah, after the Second World War, they asked so many Germans, like, where were you when they took your Jewish friends away and you never saw them again? And they all had the same answer. I didn't know. Well, you know, he said, what you're doing here, it might not stop the war, but you're informing the world, and at least after this war, nobody will be able to say, I didn't know. And I thought that is probably the mission of my life. I will now inform the world, put the information out there. If they want to read it, they read it. If they don't want to read it, then it's their choice. And I have turned an excuse, oh, we didn't know, an excuse into of an alibi. You know, that's an alibi. I didn't know, so I couldn't do anything about it. Into a choice. It's your choice. You didn't want to know. And I thought, putting that burden on the shoulders of people who are not doing anything about the misery in this world is my life mission.
Thank you.
Was that the question?
No. Duška, briefly, one thing that you feel made you a stronger person or a stronger journalist, whatever, but through your work.
Generally think about what I think about the war, that is a major waste of lives, health, time. And journalism is very, very different there than comparing with the peace circumstances. And again, I'm going to say one example. Maybe it wouldn't be helpful. So there was once that I left Sarajevo during the war, and we went to CNN in Atlanta, and there were the journalists from all over the world, mostly from the countries which didn't have the experience of the war. And they were talking about a number of international issues, including one which was very, very relevant by that time. That was O.J. Simpson affair. And I really didn't have a clue. What new can I bring to them? What can be my contribution? And I felt a little bit sad how to explain the story, that how you can have a bath with 2 liters of water, because they do have so much water. So I would, of course, you made excellent point about the journalism which we completely forgot, about humanism, about our mission to make a world better. But sometimes we become very embarrassed to even say that because people laugh on us. And that should be, and that's why I'm glad, because the journalism in the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina was different comparing with the others, because there was no distance, there was no balance, there was opinion making, and that was important. That was what mattered.
Thank you. Damir, one thing from your experiences here.
That had influence on my career.
That really, in a concrete way,
Yes,
made you who you are, which is an
Yes,
amazing
yes.
photo reporter.
I think it's actually the fact that foreign correspondents exist and what they do. You know, when I start seeing as just a Sarajevan, start seeing the first pictures by Ron Haviv from Bijeljina in 1992, I thought, you know, I'm not going to see a picture like this from a local photographer, certainly not somebody from the Bosnian side, because he wouldn't be next to the Arkan units, nor somebody from the other side. It would have to be somebody, you know, as foreign as Ron Haviv, and then the pictures from northern Bosnia and such on. So I think that's fact that you know, what foreigner can do, you know, it's just unbelievable, and I kept having this thing throughout my life.
And the photos we're talking about were photos that the photojournalist Ron Haviv took in the northeastern town of Bijeljina. This was right before the siege of Sarajevo, and he was allowed into the town with these notorious Serbian paramilitaries led by a man, former assassin known as Arkan. And he made a set of extraordinary, horrible images of people after they'd been executed. He was able to smuggle that film out. And it certainly, if we didn't know what was coming, that was as good of a sense of what was coming, because that was classic ethnic cleansing, extermination.
Yeah. And that could have been done only by a foreigner.
Right.
By
John?
a foreign correspondent.
Sorry, John?
Well, I think my perspective is a little similar to Aida's, that we would tell these stories day by day with images and video, and for years it seemed like nothing would happen. But eventually, the geopolitics changed, and the United States finally intervened in a more decisive way to help bring about the Dayton Peace Accords. But I think one lesson I learned, or what made me a better journalist, is that even if your stories do not get a cause and effect immediately, that persistence and bearing witness even again and again and again and again and again, if that's what it takes to finally to serve a purpose of making things better. And it's true, people think that journalists have their own interest, but I think most journalists, and especially people who go to places like Sarajevo or Ukraine or Baghdad, they're there because they want to tell the stories of the people. They aren't interested, especially in seeing bodies or anything like that. They're trying to help, and I think my philosophy about that was really shaped by what I experienced and learned here in Sarajevo from great people like these.
Thank you.
Can I just add something?
Please.
I agree with John, but this was my perspective in '94 when nothing was happening. In '95, I do believe that journalists actually changed the world, at least my world. The foreign intervention came that we were dreaming of, and it was a kind of something that I thought will never happen. And then the day it happened, I was aware that partly it was happening also because of me. And it was a day when I was just sitting there and I was numb. You know, like, but yes, we do change the world, and I'm proud of that.
And it wasn't just about NATO. You know, during most of the war, the U.S. and other countries imposed an arms embargo on Bosnia. And it was really only partly because of the government of Iran and certain U.S. diplomats looking the other way that weapons did get here that were very important. Let's go to some questions if we can. Oh, right there.
Here's a microphone.
Oh, great.
Hello. Does it work? Yes.
Yes.
My name is Victoria. Thank you very much for an extremely inspiring and emotional conversation. Just wanted to refer to what Aida mentioned about people's decision and their right to choose or not be informed. And while journalists are often in a bubble and we consume news and produce news increasingly, if you go out of our bubble, you see that more people choose to protect their peace, their mental health, their privacy, their time outside of work, and just not consume anything linked to wars, conflicts. As an Armenian, I know that very well. It was a struggle to make people really read about what was happening back home in 2020 and last year as well. So my question is, considering the way modern conflicts are covered and the tendencies of news consumption, as a journalist, if you covered these conflicts now, what would you change? How would you cover these stories to make sure that more people actually open up to them?
Oh, why me? Okay. If I would be covering it now, I would probably, back then I was obsessed with what the this officials say and what the that officials say and what the UN said. I would have focused really more on the people and on their stories. I'm sorry, I think I did a good job. John?
You did.
You did.
But I think I would have believed people more. You know, there was a situation when a person was telling me about mass executions, and I didn't believe him. It turned out to be true, you know. And I think now with this wisdom, I would have just covered the people. That's all you can do, you know. Unless you find something that people outside of this conflict can identify with, a housewife, a child, or this or that, they really won't bother. And when you said that people choose to not consume news, I think that's mostly because it makes them realize how helpless they are, you know, how small they are, and they watch this and they can't do anything about it. As we now watch, I was the one who was angry with the rest of the world because they didn't do anything about my suffering. I'm sitting now watching Gaza, I'm sitting now watching Kiev, and, you know, half of Ukraine being kind of wiped away. I don't know what to do, and it makes me feel terrible. So maybe one of the remedies is just to turn the TV off. I tried that, but it made me feel worse.
Thank you.
I would add that the media platforms have changed, so I think now what would be most important would be to get the information into social media, and I think we've seen that a bit with Gaza. At least in the United States, the college students are all up in arms, and it's not because of what reporters like me are reporting so much, but the sort of the raw footage that they see on social media has outraged a new generation of people in the U.S. So I think social media and the internet have the ability to bring these stories very close to people, and I think it will slowly lead to change there as well.
If I just might add on that front, we were talking about this earlier. I mean, we all know this, that the social media is building block for stories, for investigations, and often our job is to corroborate it or confirm it or geolocate it and with these incredible tools we have. But it still, to me, still comes down to stories. And there's people in this room who do amazing work combining narrative and some of these new tools. And it's to me overwhelming because it's work I could never do in my lifetime. But it's the story that engages me, the people, and not just the technology.
Based on your immensely impressive experiences, successful actually experiences, what sort of piece of advice you would give to the locals with potential journalistic potentials, locals live in Gaza and Sudan and other conflict zones?
And you mean journalists, people?
The locals who are not now journalists, but they got the potential.
But they're in places like Sudan,
Yeah, what
Gaza.
sort of advice?
What would we advise the
For
locals?
someone living in these places who's not a journalist, but what could they how could they become a journalist, or how could they become a person who disseminates information relevant to journalism?
Cooperate with journalists. Let them tell your story, because that's the only thing that's going to help you, I think, right?
Yeah.
It's a much more democratic world. I mean, people can report directly with social media. They don't need journalists necessarily if they're able to do that.
We have now, we are seeing this now with Gaza, that some of the most popular journalists are the Gazan journalists, because there are no other journalists. So, you know, I would say just work. You know, don't. You know, I think I wasted too much time thinking about how I should do things or should I do things instead of just doing them. You know, and now ways of communicating. Before I had to knock on an AP's door, hoping that somebody's going to process my film in order to look at that frame, in order to buy it, for me to appear in the world of media, right? That's a complicated procedure. And now I'm one click away. You know,
Yeah,
so I
charge your
would-
phones and report.
Yeah.
But you need to, I mean, you also need to monetize that in some way, right? If you,
No, you monetize it by surviving. You know, that's, you don't think about money in these
I
situations.
believe that what I wasn't mentioned, but now you said the monetizing is the thing that is killing a lot in journalism, because the journalist now has to be a businessman too.
well,
You know, so now I have to be manager and editor in one. That's not good. You know, it's not good if your manager is a chief editor at the same time. Right? So how to monetize? That's not my job. You know, my
I
job
just
is
mean to make a
report.
living or make money. I don't mean to have an investment portfolio. John, did you have something to say?
No, I agree with that, that the tools that are available to people now, they can go directly to social media, so keep your phone charged and get out there. But
I have a question, please.
Please.
Okay, so first of all, I'm Yumna Sayed. I'm a Gazan journalist. I have survived this. And honestly, it was very interesting for me to hear you describe 30 years ago the power of journalism in ending a suffering of a population and a war. And although it was 30 years ago, it had that power to actually expose war crimes, atrocities, and bring an end to a war or a suffering over a nation. But I want to ask today, as senior journalists ahead of us, I want to ask you, how much do you think that the journalism industry has shifted in our days today? Do you think that the journalism industry is still independent enough to report impartially, with integrity, about all kinds of war crimes, all kinds of regions, different conflicts, different kinds of wars? Has it shifted from what it has started to something different now?
May I?
Yes.
Thank you. It shifted,
It has shifted.
and it's embarrassing. And if I'm the journalist of big American or the British company, I would be very much embarrassed. Because of my war, my own war. I did something, and most of the Sarajevans considered that very, very stupid. I went to Beirut in 2006 during the short war between Hezbollah and Israel. And I was watching building destroyed in half a second of 500 kilos bombs, one bomb of 500 kilo, 1,000, etc. So I don't have the experience as that, but because of my Sarajevo experience, I wanted to go somewhere else and to see how it looks like. Talking about the Gaza, and what John mentioned, that they were thinking, they were confused how to protect themselves. Should they put the signs, etc.? I believe that occupiers, aggressors, criminals taught from the Bosnian War how journalism, how real journalism is important, and how real journalism can contribute to the truth. And unfortunately, comparing it with the Bosnian War, when the journalists were not legitimate target, journalists in Gaza are legitimate target of Israeli army. So that is a difference. Plus comparing with the numbers. So besides of telling the stories and supporting the journalists, because that is the last line of defense for Gaza. the difference between us 30 years ago and now is that I believe that every single citizen of Gaza, every single Palestinian should be the news writer. Report about your stories. Don't be only the numbers. Because we know through our war how people get tired eating their dinners and listening about wounded people suffering in Gaza. Tell us the stories. Somebody, because there are so many. There are so many.
I just wanted to say that we didn't have the means that you have now. You can report every day. You just need a mobile phone. And we didn't have that. The Sarajevans really relied on foreign press to tell the story. There was nothing else coming out. But use what you have, because whatever you think is unfair in reporting about your situation, you can counter with social media very effectively. So just do it.
I'm afraid we're going to have to stop here, but I want to continue this conversation later in the reception, but I do not want to step on the next panel because I'm very eager to hear. And I'll be happy to talk about the relationship between reporting and the ultimate decision of NATO to bomb Bosnia, because it's not quite that simple in my opinion. Anyway, thank you, all of you. It's been fascinating and inspiring.